What do you think are some of the biggest weight loss and fat loss lies that people are believing right now?
I think we can tackle this from various different perspectives. Since my expertise is in nutrition, we'll talk about some nutrition related myths first. And I think we could talk about a ton of particular individual myths, which I like to group into one recurring thing that I see on social media all the time, which is something that you and I were talking about a little bit before we started, which is this idea that there is one food or one thing, right? Fill in the blank, that is either preventing you from losing weight or it's the one thing that you need to lose weight, right? So we see it all the time with carbs and sugar and insulin, right? Or it could be your hormones that are preventing losing weight. Or it could be this magical fat loss supplement that you need, right? There are so many people online positioning themselves as gurus that have this one secret thing that you're missing that is what's preventing you from losing weight. And we can talk about each of these individually if you'd like. I'd say that's probably the biggest weight loss and or fat loss related myth that I see so often. And I think one of the main reasons why it's so popular is, again, as you and I were talking about, the basics aren't sexy, right? The basics of having a healthy diet, living a healthy lifestyle, prioritizing sleep, stress management, exercising, and understanding that improving your physical shape is something that takes time and takes effort and doesn't happen overnight. That's not sexy. Nobody wants to hear that. Or maybe people do hear it, but when they hear a sexier solution like eat these 5 fat burning foods, it's really attractive. So I feel like it's really easy to make money when you approach people's pains and desires from that perspective, right? Of like the one magic pill. I'd say that's by far the biggest thing I see all over the place, really.
So with that said, you're saying that there's not like certain foods aren't quote unquote fattening and certain foods aren't quote unquote fat burning. Because in my career as a fitness professional, like one of the things that I've heard time and time again from clients is I don't want to eat pizza. It's fattening. I don't want to have this donut. I'm going to gain some body fat. Those are all that's all a big myth, correct?
100%. And I think we have to provide some nuance here. When I talk about nutrition from a health and a body composition standpoint, and for people that are listening who maybe are or are not familiar with the term body composition, when we talk about body composition, we're really referring to the ratio between how much fat you have and how much muscle you have, right? Because losing weight, and I was actually just working on a presentation on this, like everybody talks about losing weight, losing weight. Losing weight shouldn't be the ultimate goal. It should be losing body fat, right? Or improving overall body composition, losing body fat, building muscle. Because if you just focus on the weight loss itself, you can fall into some really restrictive methods that make you lose weight, but you also lose a ton of muscle mass and you don't actually look all that different, which is not what people are aiming for, right? But from a nutritional standpoint, are there particular foods that inherently cause weight gain? And are there particular foods that inherently cause weight loss? In other words, are there foods that you eat and independent of anything else make you gain fat? No. Are there any foods that you can eat that independent of any other variable make you lose fat? No. Right? It's because nutrition is complex and there are a ton of variables at play here. And I like using extreme examples for these things because although they're unrealistic, they really paint the picture. So you mentioned pizza. Does it make you fat? Okay. Try eating only one slice of pizza, and that's all you ate every day for a couple of weeks. You would lose a ton of weight, right? Because you're just not eating all that much food, and total food consumption is really important. So when we talk about nutrition for weight loss, fat loss, I like to separate nutrition into three main variables, and those are total food consumption. So what you and I would refer to as caloric intake, energy balance, right? So total food consumption. And then beyond that, I like talking about food choices. So the foods that you actually eat. And then one step further, talking about nutrient timing or when you eat throughout the day. And each of those variables are important. But I like to present them as a hierarchy because the truth is that how much you eat by far is the most important variable that will influence whether you gain or lose fat. Beyond that, the foods that you eat are also very important because in many ways they influence how much you eat, right? So the foods that you eat don't inherently cause weight loss or weight gain, but they can contribute to weight loss or weight gain by influencing how much you eat. And then similarly, nutrient timing or when you eat can influence the foods that you eat, which can then influence how much you eat. I know that sounds a little bit confusing. So should we go into each one of those a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, I do want to follow up on something about the one food causing weight gain. You talked about pizza. I actually did this as an experiment. And I don't know the underlying details as to why this happened. So maybe you could help explain this so that I could better understand and my audience could. Is, people would say that to me all the time. I can't have a piece of pizza or I can't have ice cream because I'm going to gain a bunch of weight. And I was like, okay, I'm going to eat a couple slices of pizza and then some ice cream, and I'm going to end up stepping on the scale and I'm going to see how much weight I gain. And then I'm going to show how much weight I end up losing from being bloated like a few days or a week later or something. So I go and I get a piece of this spaghetti pizza, which it's funny. Like one of my clients was like, I was wondering who got that. And of all people, my trainer is the one who eats that. It's like pizza crust and spaghetti and then pizza crust. It's freaking delicious. And then I got like an ice cream sundae. So collectively, at most, it's like 1,500 calories between the two things. I would say at the very most. And I stepped on the scale the next day, and I was like 8 pounds heavier than I was the day before. And now I know I didn't gain 8 pounds of body fat, but the scale went up 8 pounds. Like, why do you think that happened?
There could be a couple of factors. One, typically when you eat, especially, and I'm assuming you probably had this like later at night than you typically do, or
Yeah.
at night in general. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a couple of factors here. So if you eat a large amount of food, right, like a ton of pizza and ice cream, and you have a large bolus of food at night, and let's say you ate more than you typically do at night, it takes time to digest food, right? So in the morning, you're going to be a little bit heavier because you probably still have food in your digestive system. Second off, it could also cause constipation, right? If you're eating a ton of highly processed foods, you typically don't eat that way, you're having a large bolus of it, could perhaps cause some constipation, slowing down the rate at which food moves through your intestines, again, causing you to be a little bit heavier the next day. And another factor could be water retention as well, right? Because if you're having high amounts of sodium, which I'm sure you are from the pizza and spaghetti, especially if you're having two slices of pizza stacked in between some spaghetti there, or I should say some spaghetti stacked between two slices of pizza. That's probably a good amount of sodium, and sodium results in water retention. So sometimes you might even feel like a little bit puffy the next day, a little bit of bloating. That's just water retention. And then lastly, and this one's a common one for people that perhaps follow or intentionally follow low carb diets, carbs themselves cause water retention, right? Because we store carbs as glycogen, and glycogen is associated with water retention as well. Now, people might say that's a reason not to eat carbs, but most of the water retention is in your liver and in your muscle. So it's not a bad thing at all. And being adequately hydrated is really important for sports performance too. So those are probably the main reasons why you were a little bit heavier the next day. I think also, and this is for people that believe some of these myths, I think some of the psychological stress associated with eating some of these foods also contributes to water retention, bloating, etc., because of just like the psychological stress that you're putting on yourself, right? But yeah, man, in general, like if you ever do, this is, I'm sure you do this too when I work with clients, I tell them not to worry about daily fluctuations in body weight because it literally doesn't mean anything. And what I like to do with clients is look at a 7-day rolling average because that takes into account some of those fluctuations and you have a much more stable number to look at. Because weight fluctuates from day to day, it's normal, right? If you ate a little bit later than usual, you woke up a little bit earlier than typical, you weighed yourself earlier, your digestion's slow for a particular reason. You could say this about pizza and spaghetti. You could also say this about having a very large salad before bed, right? If you typically, let's say, eat at 6 p.m., go to sleep at 10 p.m. or whatnot, like a normal person. Let's say on a particular night you ate, or just in a particular day, you ate way more vegetables than you typically do. Vegetables are pretty low in calories, which means that you get a lot of food for very few calories. And if you load up on veggies and they're high in fiber, it's going to slow down your digestion. So food's going to move slower through your digestive system. You're going to have more food in your intestines at any given time. So you might actually wake up heavier the next day if you ate a ton of veggies the day before. It's kind of funny, right? And the opposite is also true because water is so important. Like people will drink alcohol and like go out to the club or whatever and have 5, 6, 7 drinks and then wake up the next day and they're a couple pounds lighter. And they're like, how could that be true if alcohol makes you gain weight? We've all heard this, right? Alcohol makes you gain weight. It's like it's making you gain weight chronically, but acutely you might be a little bit lighter the next day because you're dehydrated, because alcohol dehydrates you. So a lot of these things that influence your body weight from day to day are just influencing either how much water you're retaining or how much food is in your intestines at any given time.
One of the things I've seen over the last couple of years, especially since the big push for people to be like skinny and thin, and more people being cognizant of that and not eating enough calories, because now I think people have over indexed on food quality where they're not eating just like some of the basic foods because of what they've maybe seen online or what they've heard or whatever. And what I've seen is that people who drink like regularly, like sometimes 20% of their calories is coming from alcohol, which that's where I think it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem with other things too, but it's like if you're eating, say, 1,500 calories a day and 300 of those calories is from like 2 glasses of wine, like that's a big issue, right? A lot of people, especially right now, I think in the diet culture we kind of exist in, it's people when they're like, I want to make a health transformation, I want to lose body fat. The immediate thing they go to is I'm going to change the quality of food that I eat. I'm going to cut out seed oils. I'm going to cut out sugar. I'm going to cut out carbs. I mean, there's name the villain, right? But I just heard you say that the most important thing is to focus on calories in, calories out, which we know, like from a scientific perspective, is that the main thing that matters from a fat loss perspective. Talk about why people should really, you know, own this first before going into food quality.
So I'm going to challenge you a bit and say that focusing on food quality is really important, but when people focus on food quality, they're actually focusing on the wrong thing altogether. Like cutting out seed oils and cutting out carbs is not improving food quality. It's not. Okay. So they think they're doing something, but they're actually not doing that at all. It's like saying, I'm going to invest money, and then you ask the person what they're doing, and they're like, oh, I'm putting money in my savings account. It's like, no, that's not investing, right? That's just putting money away and it's depreciating. So like you think you're doing something, you're actually not doing that at all. So let's quickly talk about energy balance, and then I'll talk about why diet quality actually does really matter and what people should actually focus on if they're trying to improve diet quality. So calories in versus calories out, probably one of the most controversial topics when it comes to nutrition, which is hilarious because it shouldn't be controversial at all. And the only reason why it's controversial is because people don't understand the intricacies of calories in versus calories out. Okay. People think that calories in versus calories out means eating a specific number of calories, right? And you hear people say things like, I'm in a calorie deficit and I'm not losing weight, so it can't be calories in versus calories out. If you are somebody who believes that, by definition, you don't understand what calories in versus calories out means. And by definition, if you are not losing weight, you are not in a calorie deficit. Why? So this whole term, calories in versus calories out, is what we refer to as energy balance, which is the balance between how many calories you consume, how many calories you expend. Okay. And losing weight is about being in a negative energy balance or being in a calorie deficit, which just means that you consume less calories than you burn. That doesn't mean that you have a healthy or unhealthy diet. That doesn't mean that hormones don't play a role. That doesn't mean that you may be eating very few calories and not losing weight. The thing is that energy balance is an overarching principle, and all of these other variables influence energy balance. Okay? So, for example, the foods that you eat can influence calories in, and they can also influence calories out. Because some foods, like highly processed foods, are very what we call hyperpalatable. They're very easy to overeat. So you eat a ton of calories. They also don't really influence energy expenditure or calories burnt much because they're very easy to digest. Other foods like high protein, high fiber foods tend to influence energy intake or calories in because they're very satiating. So it's easy to feel full on lower calories. They also influence energy out or calories out, calories burnt, because protein, for example, takes a lot more energy to burn. Okay, so people talk about like calories in versus calories out versus food choices or eating healthy. They're not separate things. They influence each other. Same thing with hormones. You have hunger-related hormones. There are people with issues with their ghrelin and leptin regulation, which can influence how hungry they feel. So you and I may eat the same amount of food and not feel equally satiated because there are certain issues with our hunger-related hormones that are different, right? That's one example. Hormones can also influence calories out. So, for example, your thyroid hormone, sex-related hormones like testosterone and estrogen, these hormones are influence your metabolic rate or how many calories your body burns. So if you have an issue with your thyroid and you're not producing sufficient thyroid hormone, well, you're going to have really low energy expenditure. The calories that you burn are going to be low. Again, that doesn't mean that calories in versus calories out doesn't matter. It's that you have certain things going on in your physiology, in your hormones, that are influencing the calories out or the calories inside of the equation, right? And typically when people say like, I'm not eating many calories and I'm not losing weight, there could be a couple of things going on. First and foremost, the harsh truth that people don't want to hear is that most people track calories incorrectly, right? So they think they're eating 1,500 calories, they're probably eating like 2,500 calories. And I've seen this so many times working with clients, and we do a food recall, like, man, this is way more than what you actually think it is. But let's say you're pretty confident in the way you track, you might have low energy expenditure. It might be a combination of being under muscled, right? So not having a ton of muscle, being a smaller person, because if you're a smaller person in general, you have lower energy expenditure, not being physically active, because obviously physical activity is important for burning calories. Or you might have something wrong with your physiology with certain hormones. When I work with clients, I typically, across the board, if they typically say that they eat low calories and can't lose weight, I recommend them to do two things. Get some basic blood work done, do a hormone panel, assess your testosterone, your estrogen, your thyroid hormone to see if there's anything going on with those. In particular, with women who are like peri or postmenopausal, because a lot of these hormonal changes can influence women in that age range. And in addition to that, I asked them if they're capable to do it to get a basic BMR test, which you just go into a lab, you put a little mask on, and they tell you how many calories you burn, right? So I like doing those things just to have an objective measure of whether or not like the person's caloric intake matches their energy expenditure. So that's a general overview of calories in versus calories out. And now I mentioned that food quality matters a ton, right? And so if we're talking about calories in, calories out, and that's all that matters, why does food quality matter? Well, as I mentioned lightly, food quality really matters because it can influence both calories in and calories out, right? And like you mentioned, when people talk about food quality, like, man, I cut out seed oils, I cut out all carbs, I'm eating cleaner. That is bullshit. I don't know if you allow cursing or not on the podcast, but that's one of the things that I feel so strongly about, man. It's just complete bullshit. It's so silly when people focus on these things because they're just focusing on the wrong things. So when it comes to diet quality, there are a couple things that I like to recommend to people. First and foremost, by far, consume mainly minimally processed foods, whole foods, right? Do not worry. I was about to say, do not effing worry. Do not worry about things like organic versus conventional, or frozen versus fresh versus canned. Those things do not matter, guys. And I know that's a big realization or a big thing to even like accept because this is some of the messaging you see online all the time, like buy organic, buy free range or pasture raised eggs or whatever. Don't buy frozen, buy fresh. Don't buy canned, buy fresh. And it just adds so much confusion. It adds so much noise that people are confused about what eating healthy is, right? And they think, oh, if I can't afford organic, if I can't do this, then what's the point? Because I can't eat healthy. And the truth is that those things don't really matter. I'm not going to say that there aren't any nutritional differences between organic or conventional foods, but they're likely very, very minimal. So when it comes to like veggies, yeah, organic veggies are slightly more nutrient dense. Slightly is the key word there. The pesticides and all that stuff, organic foods use them too. They just use organic versions of them. So when people talk about like buying conventional because of pesticides or herbicides, like those things are on organic foods as well. They just use organic versions of those things. And you can get 99% of that off of your food if you simply wash your produce, which you should be doing anyways, right? So the nutritional value is slightly different, but the issue is not that. The issue is that most people aren't eating enough fruits and veggies. Right? So if you just eat more fruits and veggies of the conventional stuff, you're going to be getting plenty of nutrients that way. So first and foremost, focus on whole, minimally processed foods. Why? Not because they inherently cause weight loss, but simply because they are hard to overeat. They're more nutrient dense. They're less calorically dense. They help you be essentially less nutritionally deficient compared to eating more processed foods because processed foods tend to be low in particular vitamins and minerals, specifically like ultra processed foods like candy, potato chips, etc. And again, they just help you feel full and satiated, right? So if you eat 500 calories of a baked potato, like a plain baked potato versus 500 calories of a potato chip. Big difference there in terms of how you're going to feel. You're going to feel way fuller eating the baked potato. So that's tip number one in terms of improving diet quality. There's really good research showing that this is a study by Kevin Hall, who's one of like the leading researchers in the space of metabolism and body composition. And they conducted a really interesting study where they gave participants very similar diets in terms of macronutrient composition, but one diet was a minimally processed diet, the other diet was a ultra processed food diet, but similar macronutrient composition. Okay. So you would assume like, oh, if the macros are the same, it probably had the same influence. Now, here's the caveat. People were allowed to eat as much as they wanted, right? They didn't control for calories. They just gave them the food and say, eat as much as you want. People that ate the ultra processed food diet consumed an additional 500 calories per day. Just showing that highly processed foods are easier to overconsume. That's why number one tip I recommend is just try to cut out processed foods as much as possible. I don't say eliminate them because I'm not about eliminating anything fully from your diet. Because as I'm sure you believe in this as well, like mental health and psychology is important as well. And there can be some funky things that your mind starts to do when you tell yourself that you can't eat certain things. But besides that recommendation, so eating mainly minimally processed foods, I always tell people to focus on protein and fiber, incredibly important. If you can load up on protein and fiber at each of your meals, similarly, you're going to feel very satiated and full. This is beyond the health benefits of protein and fiber, right? So fiber, we know, reduces the risk of most diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc. And protein helps with building muscle and improving overall body composition, which also is very important for health. So those are the three main things I tell most people to focus on: minimally processed foods, protein, and fiber. And if we go one step beyond that, I love giving my clients a daily fruit and vegetable goal of at least 4 or 5 servings per day. And I've actually shifted my mindset a ton on this, man, where when I would start working with a client, I would almost want to like require them to track for a certain period of time. And I still do highly encourage tracking. But I've realized that for clients who do not have these healthy habits in place, these healthy nutrition related habits in place, simply focusing on these nutrition habits, even without tracking, helps them achieve some fat loss because they naturally reduce their caloric intake, right? And we work on these while also working on things like exercise, daily step goal. I know I've gone in a million different directions there, but that's why I would say that food quality does really matter in the context of overall energy balance.
Right. And what I didn't hear you say is anything that's like super absolute, or you have to cut out like certain things. You have to cut out sugar, like, seed oils, cut out carbs, cut out fat, cut out meat. Because I think sometimes people focus on the wrong things, like you said, and they're not focusing on the things that actually matter. And the reason that I think that sometimes these can be hard to pay attention to is because they're not shiny, they're not sexy. They're just stuff that has been true and proven for years and years and years. And there's nothing necessarily, inherently special about these things. I want to go back as we start to unpack this, go back to calorie counting and calories in, calories out. In that, I've heard you say there definitely can be some value to doing this for a period of time if you're somebody who has no self-awareness around what you eat or awareness around how many calories are in certain types of food. In my career, and I'm sure you hear this too, time is super valuable to people, and it can be tough to just for everybody to weigh their food, take a measuring cup out, say, okay, is this a cup of rice? Well, maybe it's a little bit more than a cup. We got to shave it off. Oh, how much does this piece of steak weigh? Oh, like this and that. Have you found anything that's efficient and effective for the average person who's, got a million things going on, to be able to weigh and track their calories in a way that's actually effective and maintainable?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to unpack here. I'd say first and foremost, realistically, tracking doesn't take a ton of time. It might take some time to learn, but once you learn it, it does not take a ton of time. Should take you a couple of minutes, really. I think it comes down to priorities, man. I think it comes down to priorities in the sense that, like, if this stuff is important to you, if getting your health is in check, if getting your health in check is an absolute priority to you, you should be able to spend 30 minutes a day for a couple weeks to learn how to track. And then beyond that, it takes no more than 10 minutes a day. It doesn't really take a ton of time. Now, the question is, like, does somebody actually want to put in the work or not, right? And I'd say with the exception of a very small percentage of the population, most of us have way more time than we say we do. That's just the truth, right? We spend time watching Netflix or this or scrolling on our phone. we have the time. It's just planning and preparing to be successful with the things that you're trying to focus on. This is something I talk to my clients about all the time, man, because you hear it like, I don't have time, or I'm traveling, or this. And it's, they're not intentional excuses, but at the end of the day, it tells me that, like, hey, you're saying these things are important to you, but you're not willing to put in the work for these things that you're saying that are important to you, right? So that's the first thing I would say. Second off, I think you can find a way of tracking that works for you, right? Now, there's always going to be a certain degree of error. Obviously, weighing everything is the most accurate by far. And I do recommend weighing for a period of time. Now, besides that, you could take like a measuring cup, which is probably a little bit quicker than weighing, right? And is it going to be the most accurate? No, it's not going to be the most accurate. If you don't want to measure everything using a measuring cup or something like that, you can guesstimate using portion sizes with your fist or whatnot. Is that going to be accurate? No, that's going to be even less accurate. But here's the thing. If you track consistently the same way, you can probably assume that that degree of error is probably going to be pretty similar from day to day, right? And so what you need to do is, if you're tracking a particular way and you're tracking in a certain way consistently and you're not losing weight, just reduce the calories that you're targeting. And I say calories that you're targeting and not calories that you're eating, because the calories that you're targeting probably is not the same amount as what you're actually eating, because there's some error, right? And so what I tell my clients sometimes, it's like, listen, I'm telling you to eat X number of calories. Let's say it's 1,500. I know you're probably eating like 2,000 calories, because it doesn't make sense that you're stable at this weight. And we've done a BMR test and we've gotten some blood work done, and like it's telling us that you should be losing weight at this caloric intake. What that tells me is that there is a certain degree of error in the way that you track. Now, I don't want you to change anything about the way you track. I just want you to understand this. And we're going to go to from 1,500 to 1,300. I know you're not actually eating 1,300, but we're just going to target that because you're probably going to go from 2,000 to 1,800, right? So as long as you're tracking consistently in a particular way that feels time efficient and seamless for you, that's generally what I would recommend. Now, if you ask me what do I actually recommend for most people to do, is just be really diligent for 2 or 3 months, guys. Take time, weigh your stuff, because you're going to learn more by tracking things diligently. You're going to learn more about your nutrition than you otherwise would in like a way shorter time frame, because you learn about like the different caloric values of different foods, but how to make substitutions, understand what foods make you feel full, understand what foods make you overeat. You understand how to navigate nutrition when you're out and about, and how to make simple substitutions at restaurants so you can stay on top of your nutritional choices. Like all of these things are really easy to learn if you just take time to diligently track. And simultaneously, while you're tracking, develop healthy nutritional behaviors, right? So understand how much protein you should be consuming and what that looks like on any given day. Like if you ask me how much protein do I eat, I confidently say at least 200 grams. I don't remember the last time I've tracked my protein intake. How do I know I get 200 grams? Because I tracked my protein intake for so long and I know what 200 grams of protein looks like. If you ask me the same thing about fiber, I can tell you that. I aim for a daily fruit and vegetable goal. I eat 3 balanced meals every day. I eat mainly minimally processed foods. And I can do these things and not track my calories, and I can gain or lose weight if I want to without tracking calories, because I did it for a period of time. So track calories for a period of time diligently. It's not going to be fun. It's going to take some work. Simultaneously develop healthy nutritional behaviors. And then when you do that, you can back off of the tracking. It's that simple, but it does take work.
If you're like me and are constantly on the go juggling work, social outings, and all the other chaos life throws your way, I have found an absolute game changer that gives me some time back. Jimmy's Famous Meals is a local meal prep company that provides fully cooked, chef-prepared meals and can deliver them right to your doorstep. I am currently about to eat the Greek lemon chicken, which is one of my favorites. I get this every week, and I absolutely love Jimmy's Famous Meals. They are so good and delicious. Picture this: no more stressing over what to cook after a long day, and always having a wholesome, delicious meal waiting for you in your fridge. Their meals are prepped, cooked, and ready to heat and eat in minutes. So say goodbye to the hassle of grocery shopping and meal planning. With Jimmy's Famous Meals, convenience is served straight to your doorstep. So if you're looking to get your time back and make healthy eating easy, head to jimmysfamousmeals.com, and when you use the promo code Doug25 at checkout, you'll get 25% off your order. cheers to healthy eating. It does take work, and you got to make it a priority, right? And I think it's either you're. I always would say to people, like, you're either going to pay for your health now, or you're going to pay for it later. And I think that's a fact. Like, you're either going to like invest the time now to get it done, or you're going to pay for it later. And by the way, like, the older you get, I mean, just like me, I'm stubborn in certain patterns that I've had for years. And I've noticed that the older I've gotten, the harder it is to unlearn certain patterns, because I have so much more time, like, reinforcing those bad behaviors and bad habits, right? When it comes to food quality, you and I were chatting a little bit before, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, that, again, it's no disrespect to people, but the biggest problem I've had to unpack with my personal training clients over the last, I'd say, 2 to 3, 4 years, isn't convincing them to eat healthy like it used to be. It's not convincing them to eat less highly processed foods. It's not convincing them to eat more protein. It's convincing them to stop jumping after these different wellness trends that pop up every now and again. It's convincing them that not every ingredient's the boogeyman. It's convincing them to just master the fundamentals. Which of these wellness trends, whether it be cutting out seed oils, whether it be eliminating sugar completely, whether it be, only buying organic, like, which of these really bothers you the most, and is causing, you think, the most harm to the average person for believing it?
This one's tough because I think they're all equally stupid. I think the cutting out sugar one is pretty bad. Let's not say cutting out sugar. Let's say cutting out carbs, period. Because that one's really common. And I think that one is really stupid. For example, I was leaning towards saying the seed oils thing. But, like, when it comes to seed oils, I just don't think it's necessary to cut them out. There's no necessary, like, adverse health effects by consuming seed oils. And we would have to, I have an entire podcast episode going over all the research on seed oils. So it would take us like an hour to just go through that. But I don't think there's any inherent harm if somebody avoids seed oils, right? There's nothing wrong if you don't eat seed oils, but you don't have to avoid them. But when it comes to carbs, I think it's actually really dumb not to eat carbohydrates at all, for a number of reasons. One, and I would love to talk a little bit about this more in the episode, Doug, the difference between losing weight and improving body composition, the things that are important for improving body composition. One of those being building muscle. And what's important for building muscle? Performing well in the gym. And what fuels performance in the gym? Carbohydrates. And if you're cutting out carbohydrates and you care about your body composition, you're not going to perform as well. You're not going to build as much muscle. You're not going to improve your body composition compared to if you were eating adequate carbohydrates, right? So that's one perspective. Two is that all nutrients have particular health benefits. And cutting out a nutrient completely just makes no sense from a nutritional standpoint, right? So, like, if you cut out carbs altogether, I would say that's equally as stupid as cutting out fat altogether or cutting out protein altogether. Now, the difference is that we can survive longer without carbs. And this is why people say that carbs are not essential. But I think it's one of the dumbest things you can do from a nutritional standpoint. And I know I'm kind of going in circles here because I have so many thoughts just like spiraling in my mind. But first and foremost, if we think of carb-containing foods, some people say that all carbs are the same thing, right? And all carbs essentially do is raise your insulin, and insulin prevents fat loss. And so you shouldn't eat carbs if you're trying to lose body fat. Let's tackle this myth first, okay? And then we'll talk about the benefits of consuming carb-containing foods. Carbs do not cause weight gain, and carbs do not prevent fat loss, okay? So insulin is a hormone that we release in response to consuming carbohydrates. And the role of insulin is to allow us to take those carbohydrates from our bloodstream and to shuttle them into different tissues, like different organs, and into muscle as well, so that we can use it, okay? Because we need to get the carbohydrates into the tissue so the tissues can use the carbohydrate for normal metabolic processes. And so insulin is just a way to get carbohydrates, glucose specifically, into different tissues, all right? If we didn't have insulin, our blood sugar would be high, and there are a whole host of adverse health effects that are associated with high blood sugar long term. So we need insulin. Insulin is very good, right? Now, insulin can slow down. I'm not going to use the word block because it doesn't block or prevent it completely. It slows down what's called fat oxidation, or a process known as beta oxidation, which is the metabolic process by which our body takes fat and breaks it down so that we could use it for energy. Okay. And now this might sound confusing because people are like, man, insulin makes you store carbs and it stops you from burning fat. Like, what's the deal with that? It sounds like you can't lose fat if you're eating carbs. And it's not that simple. It's actually really, really complicated. Okay. And we have to think about this. Our bodies are either in an anabolic state or in a catabolic state. Anabolic meaning building tissues up, storing stuff. Catabolic meaning breaking tissues down, breaking things down in general, right? And when we are in an anabolic state, we slow down catabolic processes because it doesn't make sense to be building stuff and breaking stuff down simultaneously. And the opposite is also true. When we are in a more catabolic state, we slow down anabolic processes. Okay. So when we eat food, we are in an anabolic state, meaning that we are taking that food, breaking it down into individual nutrients, and shuttling those nutrients into the different tissues of our body. That is by definition anabolic, right? So we are slowing down catabolic processes, which means that breaking down fat, beta oxidation, is catabolic. So we're going to slow down catabolism and pump up anabolism. That's essentially what insulin is doing. It makes sense to slow down fat burning when we consume carbohydrates because we're in an anabolic state. Now, does that mean you can't burn body fat? Not at all. Because what matters is the net difference between how much catabolism, how much breakdown, and how much anabolism happens in a given day. And by the way, what you guys listening have probably heard of the terms anabolic and catabolic in reference to muscle. It's not just in reference to muscle, right? Anabolic just means growing or storing. Catabolic just means breaking down. So you could be storing glucose in fat. You could be growing fat tissue. That's anabolic. Anything that is storing or growing is anabolic, okay? We just tend to use these terms in reference to muscle, but in this context, we're not using them in reference to muscle. So what matters is the net difference between how much fat breakdown and how much fat storage there is on any given day. Yes, when you consume more carbohydrates, you burn less fat. But guess what? You also store less fat. So the net difference comes down to how many calories you consume. And I'll prove this in a second. And when you consume higher fat, so if you consume a high fat diet and no carbs, yes, you burn way more fat. But you also store way more fat because when you eat fat, it's very easy to just store it directly as fat because it's already fat, right? When we consume carbohydrates, we actually don't store much of it as fat because it's metabolically expensive. That's a hard term to understand, but it's difficult to transform a carbohydrate or a protein into a fat molecule and store that as fat, okay? So when we consume carbohydrates, we store less fat, we burn less fat. We use more of the carbohydrate for energy. When we eat more fat, yes, we burn more fat, but we also store more fat. So it's not just about how much fat you burn, it's about how much fat you burn relative to how much fat you store. And the reason why I say, I'll prove this in a second, why it doesn't matter, because there's so much research. And when I'm talking about research, I'm talking about well-controlled clinical studies showing that when calories are controlled for, aka you eat 2,000 calories, I eat 2,000 calories, you eat a ton of carbohydrates, I eat 0 carbs and a ton of fat, both people lose the same amount of body fat. No difference whatsoever. Telling us that energy balance is the overarching principle that matters. Now, beyond this, because somebody might be thinking, well, if I could lose fat on a very low carb diet, why would you advise against it? The reason why I advise against it is because if we think of whole unprocessed foods, right, which I mentioned should be what you consume more of, whole unprocessed foods that are high in carbohydrates, what are we talking about? Fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains. These are foods that have a ton of positive health benefits. They're high in fiber. We know that fiber is incredibly beneficial for health. And all different types of foods are high in nutrients that are not really found in other foods, right? So fruits have certain nutrients that are unique to fruits. Veggies have certain nutrients. Whole grains have certain nutrients, right? So it's actually very beneficial to have a wide range of foods included in your diet. You don't want to eliminate stuff from your diet for that reason. So if you want to have a healthy diet, you should have an inclusive diet that includes high amounts of minimally processed foods that are high in carbohydrates, but also high in fats, but also high in proteins, right? That's the reason why I think that cutting out carbs is probably one of the dumbest things that you can do. And I know that all my answers are long-winded answers, but hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, as a follow up question, if the goal is improving body composition, which I think when people say they want to lose weight, that is the goal, right? They want to decrease their body fat percentage. They want to like look better physically. We talked about protein, fiber. We talked about calories in, calories out. We talked about some of those non-negotiables. What are some other things that you think people should really pay attention to when it comes to improving body composition?
Yeah. So this is the number one mistake I see people make. They focus on losing weight, right? It's like, I want to get in better shape, so I must lose weight. And inherently not wrong, but I think that sort of mindset leads to a couple of things that essentially leads people to be frustrated and not see the results they want to see, right? First off, when we just focus on losing weight, and the only goal is to lose weight as quickly as possible, you are inherently going to do really restrictive, unsustainable things for the sake of losing weight, right? You might, for example, cut your calories a ton, way more than you should. You might be doing a ton of unnecessary cardio every day because you're trying to burn as many calories as possible. And yes, those things will help you lose weight, but it will also result most likely in you regaining all the weight pretty quickly. And if you don't regain the weight, it's definitely going to result in you having what's called the skinny fat look, right? Which I don't like the terminology a ton, but when you just focus on weight loss, you end up looking like a smaller version of your current self, which is not what people often want to look like. I tend to ask people, if you care so much about your weight, would you be upset if you had the same body weight but had the look the way you wanted to look? And people are like, no, I care about the way that my body looks. And so that inherently tells you that, like, hey, weight loss is not the primary goal then, right? So what is the goal? It's improving body composition. What the hell is improving body composition? We said earlier, losing body fat, building muscle, right? And building muscle there is the key. It's funny because my expertise is in nutrition, although I would also say that I have a ton of expertise when it comes to resistance training for muscle growth specifically, but like my formal expertise is in nutrition. And I say this is funny because if somebody asks me, what's the number one thing I can do to improve my body composition? It's resistance train. If you are not lifting weights and you're not lifting weights correctly with an emphasis on building muscle, I'm not going to say there's no point of doing any of the other stuff, but you're not going to get the benefits that you would compared to really prioritizing resistance training, right? And I see this with clients all the time, specifically women who do all of these HIIT-based workouts or do all of these things that just make your muscles burn, and they're doing like 20 to 30 reps, and it's more cardio than anything. And I have nothing against cardio. Cardio is fantastic. I recommend cardio if you have the time for it, but you need to prioritize resistance training. Again, and I say with an emphasis on building muscle, because you can do resistance training in a million different ways, right? But the reason why muscle is so important, first off, I think it's important to focus on improving body composition because focusing on improving body composition inherently promotes healthier behaviors, right? If you understand the things that are important to improve your body composition, you're not going to crash diet because that's not going to improve your body composition. That's going to worsen it, right? You're not going to be doing hours of endless cardio because you know that's not sustainable. That's not necessarily going to improve your body composition. And so inherently, you're going to be doing things that are a little bit healthier, a little bit more sustainable, like being in a slight calorie deficit rather than a drastic calorie deficit. Because when you're in a slight calorie deficit, you can still train really hard. You can still build muscle, right? You are going to be prioritizing resistance training instead of cardio, which is going to help you build muscle. So by far, the most important thing I think people should do is focus on body composition and prioritize resistance training with an emphasis on building muscle. And then having the nutrition and lifestyle habits that support building muscle and improving body composition, because resistance training really is the stimulus, right? I'm trying to think of an analogy for this. It's like if you have a blueprint to build a house, right? Resistance training is the blueprint. It's the stimulus. It's the input. And then you need all the other stuff, the building blocks, cement, water, whatever. I'm not much of a construction worker. I don't know what goes into building a house, but you need the stuff to support building what you're trying to build, right? So I kind of see resistance training as like the top of the hierarchy, and nutrition and lifestyle. And when I talk about lifestyle, I mean things like sleep, things like stress management, things like your food environment, right? because these things, when done correctly, support optimizing results from resistance training. And that's when people really start to see impressive improvements in the way their body looks. Dude, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this with client over and over again, where they just want to lose weight and they've been doing all of these restrictive things. We work together. They all of them lose weight. You do lose weight because you have to lose weight if you have excess fat, but weight loss itself shouldn't be the primary outcome. And most of them, not most of them, but some of them don't lose a crazy ton of weight, and their body looks drastically different because we put the emphasis on improving body composition and not just weight loss.
And from a nutrition perspective, sometimes you'll hear people say, I got to build more muscle, I'll just eat more protein. But you can't build muscle off protein alone. There has to be a need for the protein to feed the muscles, right?
Yeah, and it's not just like more protein builds more muscle. You need to eat sufficient protein to build muscle, but eating more protein does not build more muscle. And in general, if you're eating at least 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, you're in a good place. Listen, people argue about the semantics here of like 0.8 versus 0.7 versus 1 gram per pound of body weight. You don't have to get that highly specific. If you're eating about 0.7, 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight, you're good. If you feel comfortable going a little bit higher, up to a gram per pound of body weight, fine, nothing wrong with that. But when you start to overeat protein, what happens? You're displacing other nutrients. And then you get into the stuff that we were talking about earlier, where you're not getting the health benefits of consuming other foods. If you're eating way too much protein, you're probably not eating that many carbohydrates and not that many fruits and veggies, and maybe not that many healthy fats either. And all of those things are important for optimal health as well, right? Like we know consuming sufficient fat is important for optimal hormone function, and we need optimal hormone function to build muscle. And the carbohydrate stuff, we already talked about a good amount, right? So I'm not a big fan of overdoing protein simply for the reason that you're displacing other healthy nutrients from your diet. And for example, if you were eating like 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, I would just tell that person to only eat 1 gram, and that other gram have carbohydrates, because those carbohydrates are going to fuel performance and recovery, and you're probably going to progress better that way.
So while your expertise isn't in resistance training or fitness necessarily, I would love to still get your insights as we're talking about the importance of building muscle. Like generally speaking, if you were to coach yourself, and let's just say you had some excess body fat to lose and you already have a good idea on the foods you're going to eat, nutrition, what's your workout program going to look like in the gym?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is another one that is so funny to answer because people focus so much on the workout program, and like the workout program doesn't matter that much. I mean, it does matter, but the way you train matters so much more, right? And so from a programming perspective, what matters? Because people are like, should I do 3 times per week full body, or should I do a body part split, or should I do push-pull legs? It doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. You can get equal results with very similar, with very different training plans. What matters is
I'm a
that
psycho, so I like lifting like every day.
yeah, me too.
Well,
I train 5 days per week because I love it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do like push pull legs only because it's like easy for me to like just cycle through that.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great split. I mean, in general, if you can train more, it's going to be better, right? Like if you can spend more time training and you do more work, again, this is the concept of volume, which I'll touch on in a second. That's going to be better. But from a training perspective, what does your program need to ensure? And this is why the reason why I say it doesn't matter is because somebody will be like, I have this 4-day upper lower split, or like this 4-day and it's a slightly different split. Like which one's better? It's like, yo, it does not matter. They're not one's not really better than the other. Okay. So here's what matters. Regardless of your split, train each body part at least twice weekly. So one thing I would highly recommend against is the traditional body part split where you only train each muscle once a week. Why? Because there's a couple reasons. Let's just say the research clearly shows that training a muscle at least twice per week, you grow more than just training it once per week. You typically recover well within 48 to 72 hours for a particular muscle, so you're able to train it more frequently than just once a week. That's one reason, recovery. 2 is if you think about how much total work you do for a particular muscle. Let's say for your chest, you do 10 sets, right? And let's say you're going to do those 10 sets in one workout. The last 4 or 5 sets are not going to be quality sets, especially if you train hard, right? Because if you train hard, your performance decreases because of fatigue. So after 5 or 6 hard sets of chest, those other 4 or 5 sets just aren't going to be as high quality compared to if you just did them on a separate day. So even if you did the same total amount of work, If you just split it up half and half, you perform better overall, and that drives better results. So train each muscle at least twice a week. Make sure you do at least around 10 sets per muscle per week, right? 10 sets seems to be on the lower end of what's optimal for muscle growth. And for example, for your chest, that could be 3 sets of bench, 3 sets of incline dumbbells, 1 or 2 sets of flies. For the week, that would be on the lower end, right? Most people do a lot more than that. And the people that do a lot more than that probably don't train super hard, because that's actually a decent amount of volume if you're training adequately hard, right? I think for most people, staying within the 12 to 15 sets per week per muscle is a pretty good place to be at. So we've talked about how many days per week you should train each muscle, how many total sets. Those two variables can be split up into many different training programs. You could do that 3 times per week full body. You could do that 4 times per week upper lower. You could do 5 times per week upper lower push pull legs. You can do 6 times per week push pull legs. One of those is not inherently better than the others. The only time that the more days becomes better is if you're doing more total work, because volume, aka how much work you do, is linearly correlated with muscle growth. In other words, if you do more volume, given that you're training equally hard, it's going to result in better growth. Given, big caveat here, that you're recovering properly, right? Because if you're training so much and you're not eating much and you're not sleeping well and you're not recovering better, in that circumstance, you could argue that that person would do better on lower volume because their recovery is impacted. What I would recommend to that person is to prioritize your sleep and eat a little bit more, right? But given that you can recover, more work is going to be better. And you can typically do more work if you go to the gym more days. But aside from that, the split itself does not matter, okay? Now, in terms of exercise selection, don't be doing any funky stuff on a BOSU ball or anything that requires you to balance yourself a ton, because those movements are inherently not conducive towards muscle growth. Why? Because to grow a muscle, stability is very important, okay? So when you're trying to make a muscle grow, the most important thing is that that muscle is the limiting factor during the exercise, okay? So that muscle is actually reaching near fatigue and near what we call muscular failure, which means that no matter how hard you're contracting, you can't really do another repetition because the muscle has failed. Okay, you don't want your balance to be what's causing you to fail. You don't want your heart rate to be what's causing you to fail. It's like sometimes people do resistance training and what they're doing is cardio, or what they're doing is a mobility workout, or like a stability / balance, which I don't like those terms anyways. But making sure you choose stable exercises. Things with barbells and dumbbells are great. Beyond that, for muscle growth specifically, machines are fantastic, because machines are very, very stable, right? So you could argue that something like a leg press or a hack squat from a muscle growth perspective is better than doing like a barbell squat. The differences are probably very, very minimal, but unless you are mechanically built to be a really good squatter, oftentimes the quads are not the limiting factor when you squat. Right? Sometimes your low back is a limiting factor, or your balance is, because your technique suffers a little bit. So exercises that are more stable, like a leg press or a hack squat, allow you to push closer to muscular failure, thus providing a better stimulus for muscle growth. So we've covered training frequency, we've covered volume, we've covered exercise selection a little bit. In terms of exercise selection, I like to have, for most muscle groups, like let's say for my chest or my quads or any big muscle group, I like to have 2 compound movements on on the low end per week. One is typically a free weight movement because I enjoy free weight movements. One tends to be a machine-based movement. So for example, actually for my quads, I'm mainly doing machine-based movements. So I like doing a hack squat. I like doing a Smith machine squat. And then I like having 1 or 2 isolation-based movements. I like isolation-based movements because you can get more volume for the muscle and they tend to be easier to recover from because they're not as fatiguing because you're just not lifting that much weight, right? So for example, for my chest, I do incline dumbbell chest press. I've been doing weighted dips. Those are my main compound movements that are free weights. I do a machine chest press, which is a compound movement that is machine-based. And I do some flies, which is my isolation movement. So generally 2 or 3 compound movements, 1 or 2 isolation movements per muscle per week is sufficient. I know I'm covering a ton here, so let me know if I'm going all over the place. I think the last really important variable to talk about here is rep ranges, right? Because people often are like, should I do 6 to 8 reps or should I do 12 to 15? Does it matter if I'm trying to get toned, or does it matter if I'm trying to get if I'm trying to bulk up. The truth is, it doesn't matter. What matters is intensity, the proximity to failure. So if you train with 6 reps and it was really hard and you were really close to failure, or if you trained with 15 reps and it was really hard and really close to failure, those two probably produce pretty similar results in terms of muscle growth. Now, some exercises naturally lend themselves to lower reps versus higher reps, like a squat. If you do 20 reps, your cardio is probably going to be the limiting factor, right? Because it's really hard. It's a full body movement, essentially. You're going to be breathing really hard. It's going to be hard to get near failure at 20 reps. So something like a squat or a big compound free weight movement, I typically recommend the lower rep range, maybe 10 reps or below. Now, you can't go too low either. Like if you're doing 1 or 2 reps, you're just not doing sufficient work. So for muscle growth, we see that between 6 and 20-ish reps seems to be optimal for muscle growth. Some argue that beyond that, even up to 30 reps is okay, but I just don't see the practicality of doing 30 reps near failure. Most people, it just doesn't make sense. And some exercises lend themselves towards higher reps, like isolation movements. You're not going to do 5 reps on a bicep curl. It's just not going to be that effective. Because it's going to be a ton of joint stress. You're not going to get a ton of mind muscle connection with the bicep. So it makes more sense to go for higher reps in some of those isolation movements. So that's general rep ranges. Intensity is what matters. Rep ranges don't matter all that much. And the last thing, which I'll touch on, which is the most important thing by far, is that you're getting stronger over time, right? Objectively, progressively overloading your training. So if today you're doing the exact same workout with the same weight and the same reps as you were a month ago, you have objectively not gained any muscle, unless your technique has gotten way better and you've slowed down your tempo and all that. But given that all of the variables are the same, you haven't gained any muscle, because you need to provide your muscle with additional stress, which means that you need to add 5 pounds here or there. You need to add a rep here or there. So you always have to be striving to hit small PRs, given that you maintain the same good technique, because it's easier to get more reps if you just move faster or cut your range of motion. But yeah, those are some of the main things, man. I would also touch on things like range of motion, which is important, but there's a ton of more variables we could touch on. But I'd say those are some of the main things that people should focus on for muscle growth.
Yeah, from what I've learned, it's all about the stretch, right? The deeper you can get in the range of motion, the more muscle you're going to build. I think the overarching theme you talked about was focusing on quality, not quantity. Like you could do 20 sets of chest, but if your reps are crap, it's not going to be nearly as effective for the person who goes in there and does 5 or 6 really strong sets of chest where they're focusing on range of motion, quality reps, training till near failure, etc. You've heard over the years that doing something is better than nothing in the gym, and kind of what you just shared. I'm not saying it kind of is the opposite of that, because some movement is better than not doing anything at all. But I guess speaking of the person, I've seen a lot of people in my career, or just observing people in the gym, who just go and they get on the machine circuit and they'll just pump out a few reps on the chest press and a few reps on the seated row, do some leg extensions, some leg curls, call it a day. They're maybe not looking at what the weight is on the machine. They're just in there and they're checking a box. Again, not to demonize that, because I think that is a good first step. Talk about the importance of taking it to the next level so that somebody can actually see results.
Yeah, that's just what you mentioned is just general exercise, right? Which is good for your health. That's the same thing as going and doing some cardio or going and doing a HIIT workout. It's good for your health. There's a difference between things that are just good for you, movement is good for you, versus things that are going to improve muscle mass. It's really hard to build muscle. If you want to stimulate muscle growth, you have to train really hard. You have to actually push your muscle near its limits. You don't have to fail on every set always. I actually would recommend never failing, but you have to get really close to that point. This is something, Doug, that's really hard for people to learn, because most people's experience with exercise is cardio-based, right? Most people's first experience with exercise is playing sports as a kid. Most sports are cardiovascular-based exercises. And so when people start resistance training, they don't really understand the physical cues that let them know whether or not they're actually training near failure, right? So you'll have clients say oh, that was really hard, or my legs were burning, or I was breathing really hard, or I was sweating a ton. None of those are indicators that you did an effective set for muscle growth, right? The only indicator is that you can't do another 2 or 3 reps, even if you had a gun to your head. You can't, right? And the way that I like to do this with clients, and this is why I'm such a big advocate for trainers and coaches is because having somebody give you feedback expedites this process, right? I lost so many years because I learned everything on my own, just watching YouTube videos. And it takes forever to learn on your own. And you can learn it on your own, but it takes a long time. Whereas having a coach or a trainer, you can expedite this process. But the number one tip I would give people is take a video of yourself training. And if you look at your sets, do not worry about how hard it felt, how much it burned. Just do one thing. Look at your first rep and look at your last rep and ask yourself, is my last rep way slower than my first rep? The answer should be yes, right? If they look pretty similar in terms of speed, you have so many reps left in the tank, you don't even know, right? Another really good indicator is, so people will do like, you'll ask them, hey, what are you doing today? And they're like, oh, I'm going to bench 135. I'm going to do a 3x12. If you're doing 3 or 4 sets in the same number of reps on every set with the same weight, you're not training hard enough. Your reps should naturally decrease from set to set. Not intentionally. It's not like the first one I'm going to do 12 and the second one I'm going to do 10 on purpose. It's you should not be able to do the same number of reps because of fatigue, right? If I take one set really hard and I push it near failure, and let's say I do 12 reps, and that was really hard, the next set I should only maybe be able to do 10 or 11 at the very most, right? And the third set I might only be able to do 9 or 10. So if you are, again, doing the same number of reps across the board with the same weight, that's a direct indicator that you're not training hard enough for muscle growth specifically. And the last indicator I'll give is how long you rest. I'll have clients when I start with them and I'll provide them their training plan and they complete a workout in 20 minutes. I'm like, there's no damn way you completed this workout in 20 minutes. This is at the very least a 60-minute session. And they're like, well, I was resting about a minute and I was just good to go. And I'm like, man, if you're resting a minute, you are not training hard enough. And I recommend clients rest 3 to 5 minutes between sets for exercises for big compound movements. And typically what I get is like, that just seems too long. I'm ready to go after a minute. If you're ready to go after a minute, you did not train hard enough. You did not train hard enough. And if you don't have time to be in the gym that long, then cut the amount of work you do in half and make sure you train each set very hard. The intensity is more important than the volume. Volume follows intensity. You need to be training intensely enough and then add volume. But if you're not training hard enough, it doesn't matter how much you train, you're not going to be building muscle, right? So if you do a set of squats and 3 to 4 minutes doesn't seem too short, you're not training hard enough. And that's a harsh realization for people to realize, because most people most people rest 60 seconds and they do a 3x12. And they wonder why they're not getting stronger and building muscle. It's usually because they're not training hard enough.
And I think one of the other things that I've seen that inhibits people from seeing results is trying to go from 0 to 100. And they try to go from the person that doesn't work out at all to like seeing a podcast like this or even like stuff on social media and being like, you know what, I'm just going to go start working out 3, 4, 5 days a week, even though I haven't moved my body in like 10 years. I know a lot of your approach is habit based. And I know we've talked a lot about information in this podcast. And you've also talked about just simple habits, some things people should focus on, whether it's, protein, fiber, fruits and vegetables. What advice do you have for people when it comes to building healthier habits that you've seen that have been effective with your clients?
Yeah, I almost have like a step-by-step framework that I like to use for this. First off, because some people have some habits and don't have others, right? Or maybe they're doing some things kind of well and not doing some other things. First and foremost is like identify what are the habits that you need to work on, right? Because I've talked about protein, fiber, this, that, like you might be doing some of those things. So first off is identify the ones that you're not doing currently and identify the ones that like are going to give you the biggest return on investment, right? So like from a nutritional standpoint, I would tell somebody before they're even focusing on like their veggie goal, focus on minimally processed foods first. If you're mainly eating highly processed foods, if you're not doing any physical activity, just focus on daily step goal. Like figure out the ones that are going to give you the biggest return on investment first. Identify those habits. And then use this very, very simple framework. Start with one at a time. Okay. Start with one at a time and don't even like go from 0 to 100 with that one habit. And this is what I mean. I use the example of protein. You can use the same exact thought process for any habit. Let's say you find out you only eat 100 grams of protein. And you should be eating 200 grams of protein. Good luck going from 100 to 200 overnight. Like some people are going to be able to do it, but it's difficult, right? So identify the habit, protein. Identify your starting point, 100 grams. Make it slightly more difficult than where you currently are. Maybe you go from 100 grams to 115 grams. Do that consistently. Do that for a week or two. When 115 grams feels easy, graduate it to 130 grams. When that feels easy, graduate it to 145 grams. You do that slowly over a couple of weeks, you get to your 200 grams. When the 200 grams feels easy, you introduce habit number 2, right? And then you do habit number 2, same process. Then you do habit number 3. This is pretty much a foolproof way of developing healthy habits, right? So if you don't train at all, yeah, like Doug said, maybe don't go from 0 to 5 days in the gym, and don't go from not training to doing 2-hour sessions. Maybe you start by doing 2 weekly sessions that are about 20 to 30 minutes. Then from 2 sessions, you can go to 3 sessions. And then from 20 to 30-minute sessions, you can go to 45-minute sessions. And you slowly build up. How much do you build up? You build up to a point that feels sustainable for you, that fits your lifestyle, and supports your goals. It's that simple, because everybody's goals are different, right? If you're trying to be a competitive level bodybuilder, that's fine, but you're going to have to be in the gym way more than somebody that just wants to look good and feel good, right? Very different goals there, even though the methodology is fairly similar. And I would recommend taking that approach for every single habit. Now, if we go a step further, we talk about strategies to actually make the habit stick, because most people have tried developing healthy habits and they struggle. One of the reasons is because they tackle too much at once. But let's say you start to develop this approach. There are other things that you can do to make them easier too. For example, habit stacking, right? Trying to incorporate the habit that you're already trying to do into something that, or trying to incorporate the habit that you want to do into something that you already do. The example that I like to use when it comes to protein, let's say you typically have oatmeal for breakfast, right? Your habit is, I have oatmeal for breakfast. Instead of completely changing your breakfast for something completely different, like let's say some chicken sausage and something else or whatever, because it's a higher protein breakfast, that's not a bad thing to do, but it would be way easier to just add a scoop of protein into your oatmeal, right? So you're trying to take the thing that you do and incorporate it, or take the thing that you want to do and incorporate it into the thing that you want to do. And you can do that for everything, right? Like with walking, you can incorporate that into something you already do. For example, if you take calls for work, you can go for a walk while you go on a call, right? Habit stacking, really important. Using visual cues. When it comes to nutrition, I think this is so important. Keeping the foods that you're trying to eat more of in visible places in your house, right? So if you open your fridge, your healthy options that you're trying to eat more of should be at eye level. The things that you're trying to eat less of should not be eye level. They should be probably in the back of your fridge where you don't see them, or just keep them out of the house altogether. Reorganize your pantry for the same thing. So visual cues, habit stacking, and then one that I think is really important, and this comes more from a psychological perspective, is having a growth mindset, positive self-talk, right? This one's a little bit, sometimes people think this is like a little bit cheesier, but I think language matters so much, right? Like when people are like, man, it's hard for me to eat healthy because I'm not a healthy person. You're setting yourself up for success, right? You're telling yourself that you are not meant to do the thing that you want to do. It's like you should be confident, and you should be confident that you can do the thing that you want to do, because if you don't think that you can do the thing that you want to do, well, you're setting yourself up for failure from the beginning, right? So if you experience setbacks, understand that setbacks are normal. Rather than dwelling on them, analyze what went wrong and strategize on how you can improve, right? And give yourself grace and understand that making changes is difficult. This one thing, Doug, is so powerful for clients. Like, I'm sure you've experienced this too, where you work with a client, they're doing all these things, they're doing them correctly, and they experience some setbacks. They're like, man, I just can't get it right. Like, I always screw up. I'm like, hey, you're not unique. Everybody screws up. Don't be so hard on yourself. It's not a big deal. You screwed up. That's okay. Let's talk about why you screwed up. Let's maybe talk about, hey, if you're in this situation again, what can we do a little bit differently to improve? And let's just get back on track tomorrow. And that relieves so much mental stress that people put on themselves unnecessarily. And usually it's a really big catalyst for long-term progress.
I forget where I originally heard this term from. I think it was from Lane, who said, a lot of times people end up stepping over dollars to pick up pennies. And I think this happens a lot in the nutrition space. And I think somebody might be saying after they hear this conversation, like, Joey, you laid out all these frameworks for fat loss and improving body composition. You talked about calories in, calories out. You talked about improving food quality. You talked about resistance training. You talked about building muscle. You talked about protein. Where's fasting? Where does this all fit into this? Talk about your thoughts on fasting and why that shouldn't be like the go-to for fat loss.
Yeah, so fasting's okay, right? We could talk about fasting in the same realm of like other things related to like biohacking, right? Like maybe cold water plunges or all these things. I'm not going to use the word distractions, but they are just tools in a tool belt. Okay, there are tools in a tool belt that you can use. Okay, we'll use intermittent fasting or fasting in general in the context of diet, right? Because we can say, where does fasting fit into this? But we could also say, where does keto fit into this? Or where does paleo fit into this, right? These are tools in a toolbox, guys. They are not must do things. Again, intermittent fasting, keto, whatever it is, if it results in weight loss, it results in weight loss because it helped you create a negative energy balance. Going to the beginning of the episode, it helped you consume less calories than you burn, period. So if intermittent fasting for you is something that you enjoy, it doesn't feel restrictive, it helps you naturally reduce your caloric intake, do it. It's fine. But you're not losing weight because you're fasting. You're losing weight because you are reducing your caloric intake relative to your caloric expenditure. Okay. And I think that's really important to understand, because sometimes people are fasting, they're losing weight, and they think they're losing weight because they're fasting. And then for a particular reason, on some day they couldn't fast. And now they think it's the end of the world. And it's not the fasting itself that's causing weight loss. It's not the ketogenic diet that's causing weight loss. It's not the carnivore diet that's causing weight loss, right? All of these things have underlying principles. I'm not against any of these things, except the carnivore diet I'm pretty against for a number of reasons. But all of these things can be useful tools to achieve a particular goal. None of them are inherently better or worse than others. It's just what works for you based off your preferences and your lifestyle, right? I think fasting can be an incredible tool. I used to use intermittent fasting every time I tried to lose body fat, because for me, it was just easy to skip breakfast. I actually nowadays recommend people not skip breakfast, because there's a lot of really good research showing that people who consume breakfast have higher energy expenditure and better hunger and satiety regulation as well. So if people intermittent fast, I typically recommend cutting out the last meal of the day, which is fairly unrealistic for most people. I do think breakfast is pretty important. But again, we're going into minutia here that makes a very, very small difference. That's my general take on things like fasting or anything of that nature. It's like, can it be helpful? Yeah. It's hard to deny that a ton of people have success with it. It's just important to understand why they have success with it. It's not an inherent benefit of the thing. It's that it's just causing, in this case, it's making it easier for the person to be in a negative energy balance to achieve weight loss. On the flip side of that coin, you can gain weight doing intermittent fasting if you just eat too much, right? And this is why I think like understanding the reasons why is really important, because somebody might say, I'm going to fast, which means that I can eat whatever I want in whatever quantity I want. Fasting is magical. It's awesome. It's like, no, that doesn't work, right? You can very much gain weight. I mean, there are athletes who fast and they bulk while fasting and gain substantial weight, because the amount of food that you eat really matters. It's just easier to eat less food if you cut out a meal. Think about it. If you go from eating 3 meals to 2 meals, you're probably just going to eat a little bit less overall, which will probably result in some weight loss.
Do you think one of the benefits of people who fast is that they have like a routine, they have an actual schedule that they adhere to as far as eating windows? I mean, don't you think that part is actually super valuable for people? Because otherwise, they're like, oh, did I eat breakfast today? I ate lunch. Oh, wait, when am I going to fit it in? Like
100%, 110%. This is earlier when I mentioned energy balance, food choices, nutrient timing. We didn't talk about nutrient timing at all, but this is, I would say, the one benefit. Yeah, like there's really good research also that people who have a regular meal schedule, which simply just means eating at the same times every day, have better body composition and weight loss outcomes. Because it just comes down to prioritization, having a schedule, staying on top of what you're doing. You're probably just more adherent, right? So yeah, 100% agree. Probably one of the biggest benefits of fasting is that you have a particular schedule. I don't eat at this time, I eat during these times, and you're a little bit more regimented, which again does what? Helps with adherence, right? And adherence, sticking to the thing you're going to do, is so important, because so many people say, I'm going to do this diet, I'm going to do that, and they don't stick to it. They're like, oh, that diet didn't work. It's like, no, you just didn't stick to it. But besides that, yeah, I totally agree with that. But I am a big fan of just having an eating schedule with breakfast and not necessarily having to fast. But again, if that works for people, I'm not against it at all.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think would be beneficial for people to hear and understand regarding, the topics of improving body composition, fat loss, building muscle, etc.?
The only thing I would say is that most people underestimate the impacts of sleep, right? Like people tend to think about being healthy or looking a certain way as like nutrition and exercise. Yes, those things are two pillars of having a healthy body composition, but I would say sleep is the third pillar. like for sure. And sleep in many ways impacts the other two. And when it comes to sleep, like there's so much around sleep about what things you should be doing, what things you shouldn't be doing. Try to sleep with the normal, like circadian rhythm. Like, what do I mean by that? Just going to sleep when the sun goes down around 9 or 10 p.m., waking up early in the morning, get 7 or 8 hours of sleep. It's pretty healthy routine to have. There's plenty of evidence showing that people who have sleep or are restricted or are sleep deprived chronically, so get less than 6 or 7 hours of sleep regularly, have one, greater hunger cravings, right? So they tend to eat more food. They tend to choose more calorically dense foods. And they also have substantially less energy expenditure. So if you are hungrier, you're eating more food and you're burning less calories. That's a recipe for weight gain, right? So from that perspective, not good. Also, people who are sleep restricted have a significantly higher risk of disease development. So we've just been talking about body composition, but things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, etc., higher risk if you chronically get poor sleep. And lastly, from the exercise perspective, adequate sleep is so important for optimal hormone function, which is important for building muscle and recovery from exercise. Sleep is incredibly important for recovery. We talked about earlier, if you're doing a ton of work but you're not recovering, you're not going to really progress. So I would just emphasize sleep, man. And having when we talked about nutrition, you just mentioned having a schedule. Have a schedule with your sleep as well. It's not going to be perfect every day. If you're a parent with young kids, I have a 21-month-old. Sleep is all over the place sometimes, but I do my best. I think having a super simple sleep hygiene routine is really helpful. For me, it's typically around 8:30. I'll take a shower. I'll wind down for a little bit, try to be in bed by 9:30. All the lights are off. It's nice and cold in the room. Optimal sleep condition, nothing too complicated. But that's probably the only thing I'd add there.
Well, Joey, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on here and sharing all your valuable insights. I think people are going to get a ton of great information from this episode, and they're going to want to check out your podcast. They're going to want to follow you on social media. Where's the best place to get in touch with you and to follow along with everything that you're doing?
Yeah. So on social media, it's at Dr. Joey Munoz. That's Dr.JoeyMunoz. And my podcast is the Dr. Joey Munoz Show because I'm not very creative. And then if potentially people want to work with me or want to learn a little bit more from me, if you go on my social media, you'll see on my profile like a free ebook you can download from me. And if you want to check out what I do with my clients, also on my social media, you'll be able to see my coaching business, fitforlifeacademy.health. But that's pretty much everywhere.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast. And like I said, I think the audience is going to really get a lot of value out of all the nutrition and wellness info that you shared.
Awesome, brother. Thank you for having me.
You got it, man.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.